146 people died in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in 18 minutes. Their families were paid $75 a life, and the two men who owned the factory collected $400 a life from their insurer. Stay for the $20 fine, because that number is the whole story. This is the ledger of March 25, 1911. 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Asch Building, corner of Washington Place and Greene Street. About 500 people made blouses here, mostly Italian and Jewish immigrant women, some of them 14 years old, earning $7 to $12 for a 52-hour week. The building had 2 stairways. At quitting time, every worker was funneled into one of them, the Greene Street stairs, where a foreman searched their handbags for stolen lace. The second stairway, at Washington Place, was kept bolted. That was the whole system. One exit, one search, no theft. Under Section 80 of New York's Labor Code, locking a factory door during working hours was a misdemeanor. The maximum penalty on a first conviction was a $50 fine. Remember, $50, it comes back. 13 months before the fire, these women had struck this factory and won. Shorter hours, better pay. What they never won was the door. The triangle floors had no sprinkler system. Almost no factory did, because no law required one. And 3 weeks before the fire, an industry group publicly fought the idea of requiring them, telling a New York newspaper that sprinkler rules were, in their words, cumbersome and costly, and amounted to confiscation of property. That was the argument. That was the price of a life, argued in advance. In print, there was also a letter. A mechanical engineer named H.F.J. Porter, who installed factory fire drills for a living, had written to the Triangle asking for an appointment. He never got an answer. Afterwards, he told the Times that only 2 or 3 factories in the entire city ran fire drills, and he repeated what one owner, not a Triangle owner, had said to his face: "Let 'em burn. They're a lot of cattle anyway." Later, under oath, New York's fire chief John Kenlon told the state commission investigating the disaster that if the Asch Building had been fitted with an automatic sprinkler system, he believed not a single life would have been lost. Not fewer. Not most saved. Not one. Saturday afternoon, about 4:40, on the 8th floor, in a scrap bin under a cutter's table, cotton clippings caught. Nobody has ever proved what lit them. A match, a cigarette, both were reported by the fire marshal. It did not matter. The floor was stacked with lawn cotton, tissue paper, wicker baskets, and wooden tables. A bookkeeper, on 8, got a telephone through to the 10th floor, where both owners were. There was no alarm bell in the building, and no way at all to reach the 9th. One survivor, Yetta Lubitz, said the warning reached the 9th floor at the same moment the fire did. Inside 3 minutes, the Greene Street stairway, the searched exit, the only exit they used, was gone in both directions. Workers crowded onto the one exterior fire escape, a flimsy iron structure the city had allowed the builder to put up instead of a required 3rd staircase. It buckled, twisted, and dropped about 20 people nearly 100 feet into the courtyard. And at Washington Place, they reached the 2nd door, and it would not open. A passerby pulled box 289 at 4:45. Engine 72 was on the street in about 90 seconds. Then ladder 20 ran up the tallest ladder in New York City, and it stopped at the 6th floor, roughly 30 feet below the windows. The life nets tore like paper. The department knocked the flames down in 18 minutes. Everyone who died inside that window. 146 people, 123 women and girls, 23 men. The youngest were Kate Leone and Rosaria Maltese, both 14. The building survived almost undamaged. It is still standing today. On the 11th of April, a grand jury indicted Max Blank and Isaac Harris on 7 counts of manslaughter. They posted $25,000 bail and hired Max Stoyer, the most expensive defense lawyer in New York. The prosecution's theory was narrow, and it had to be. Conditions at the Triangle were not much worse than the industry standard, and breaking the labor code was worth a $50 fine. There's your $50. So prosecutor Charles Bostwick built the case on one death, Margaret Schwartz, who died at the Washington Place door. Lock a door during working hours, and a death follows. That is not a misdemeanor anymore. That is manslaughter. Worker after worker testified they could not open that door. The fire chief said his men had to chop through doors to get in. But the charge Stoyer had to beat was the door locked? Did these 2 men know it was locked that afternoon? He took the prosecution's best witness, a survivor named Kate Alterman, and made her repeat her account until a jury of 12 men heard a rehearsed script instead of a memory. December 27, 1911. After 23 days of trial and more than 100 witnesses, the jury deliberated under 2 hours and acquitted both men on every count. Now the ledger, which is the part almost nobody tells you. Blank and Harris were insured. When the claims were settled, their insurance paid them roughly $60,000 more than the fire had actually cost them in documented losses. Divided by the dead, about $400 a body in profit. 23 families sued. The suits ground on for 3 years, and on the 11th of March, 1914, they settled at $75 per life lost, under $11,000 total for 146 people. Sources still disagree over whether that money came from the factory's owners or the building's owner. Nobody disagrees about the number. $75 in, $400 out. In today's money, about $2,600 against $14,000. August 1913. Max Blank was hauled into court again for locking a factory door during working hours. He was fined $20, and the judge apologized to him for the imposition. December, inspectors found rubbish piled 6 feet high and scraps in wicker baskets in his new factory. He got a warning. 1914. The partners were caught sewing counterfeit Consumers League labels, the tag that certified a garment was made in safe conditions, into their blouses. The Triangle Waist Company closed in 1918. Neither man ever spent a day in prison. 11 days after the fire, New York buried the unidentified dead. Around 100,000 people marched behind an empty hearse for 6 hours in the rain, and roughly 300,000 more stood and watched them pass. That crowd is what finally moved the money. On the 30th of June, 1911, the state created the Factory Investigating Commission, chaired by Senator Robert Wagner, vice-chaired by Assemblyman Al Smith, with Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor on the panel. It ran 4 years, heard hundreds of witnesses, and by Cornell's count, 36 of the laws it drafted were passed. Automatic sprinklers, fire drills, marked exits, fire alarms, and a requirement that factory doors stay unlocked while people are inside. One of the commission's investigators had watched the 9th floor from across Washington Square. Her name was Frances Perkins. 22 years later, she became the first woman in a U.S. cabinet and the architect of the New Deal. And she said this: "The New Deal began on March 25, 1911, the day that the Triangle factory burned. That is the bill. It was paid in Albany by everybody, except 2 men. So here is the account, the way this channel keeps it. Saved, the cost of a sprinkler system and 1 bolted door. Spent, 146 lives in 18 minutes. Collected, about $400 a body. Paid out, $75. Fined, $20, with an apology from the bench. Charged, nothing that stuck. The rest of the bill went to everyone else. 36 laws, a new labor department, and eventually a new deal built by a woman who stood in the crowd and watched them fall. And in 2011, a researcher named Michael Hirsch finished naming the last 6 victims nobody had ever identified. 100 years late, at the centenary, all 146 names were read out loud in front of that building. Every fortune has a story. Most of them end in red ink. Subscribe, and I'll see you at the next collapse.